link there and some sort of agreement that they had with Marvel and obviously the guys behind the Incredible Hulk. So I know that there's that element to it as well, but I can only assume because he's using it here that they've been able to get around that somehow. But Hogan's always used the Hulk Hogan image, likeness, name, music, colors, and everything for merchandising. So I'm guessing that somehow Hogan's always had his kind of finger in the pie for that anyway.
That's for sure. Damn smart.
Yeah, definitely.
He's pretty intelligent on that, because again, without that, it might have been a harder sell to get him over. The fact you've got all that is obviously gold, isn't it, for WCW? I mean, you're getting the full package, other than, say, the real American music. But let's face it, everything else is there. So, you're getting everything. People will notice Shaquille O'Neal came out earlier in all that. Big Shaq, who, of course, did have a little. He did like the Battle Royal, didn't he, a few years ago, I believe, in the WWE WrestleMania somewhere. There's Ric Flair in another one of his robes. You'll notice coming out of him, there's Sherry there alongside him. But a little bit of pyro going on here as well. And like you say, John, I think, I don't want to sort of like, I know it sounds odd to compare them, but I feel like WCW jumping on this match so early, the way they did it, lost identity a little bit. And it was almost like how I'd see TNA end up booking very recently. Like every time they'd get a guy over, they'd be in the main event and they'd probably win the belt. And it seems very much a rush. I know this is the match, but I don't know. Would I have preferred to have seen a little bit more build-up? Would I have liked to have seen Hogan establish himself a little bit more in WCW? In hindsight, yes, I would. I would. I think why they didn't sort of aim this towards Starrcade, quote unquote, their biggest show, their WrestleMania, and level it up towards there and have Hogan chase. And then when the catch comes, it's going to be even bigger. I'm not too sure. I mean, what would you have done? Would you have waited, or would you have pounced on this straight away?
Well, you can understand why they pounced on it straight away. Obviously, for the money, for the buy rates, let's kind of get Hogan's WCW career off with a bang. But yeah, I mean, kind of a lot of. I mean, it kind of flies in the face of what WCW would usually do. And WCW were always kind of renowned for these great stories and these great payoffs. And they kind of, did almost the reverse of what they would typically do. And it was obviously just to get that kind of big first match of Hogan's. And it was a first big match as well, because it was for the championship. And Flair was the WCW World Champion. I think that he, traded it backwards and forwards with Vader the year before, going into 1994 as well. That was a very memorable feud. So I can only assume they saw dollar signs as soon as Hogan put his paw print on the dotted line. And but like I say, in hindsight, maybe they should have done a few months build, save it to Starrcade, get everybody hyped up, have an even bigger buy rate potentially. But they thought, well, let's hit the ground running. They capitalized on it as quickly as they could.
Interestingly, WCW, I mean, they really are going on the history here. They brought Mr. T in, of course, who was synonymous with known association with Hogan in those early WrestleManias, at least.
Absolutely.
Big part of that. You got Jimmy Hart there, who we know is kind of friends with outside of the business. So this is they're almost embracing this, whereas, they are very confident in Hogan, whereas on the other side of things, they weren't very confident with Flair. I've got to ask this because we haven't spoke about this, but what do you think Ric Flair's reaction was to having Hogan in? This must have been a nightmare in a lot of ways, because I'm guessing, although they could have worked more together, I'm guessing that Flair at this point is going to realise that this is again going to go in another different direction that probably isn't going to involve him too much, having Hogan in at this point, even though he's the heel. What do you think his feelings were at this point?
Well, it's probably mixed emotions, really, because you're probably thinking, well, yes, I know Hogan. I know I can work with him. I've worked with him before, and I know that I can put on a fairly good match with him. And business-wise, yes, Hogan's going to bring more eyes to the product, potentially more money in the tin, more money for everybody, including Flair as the champion. But then, you could think, well, Hogan's coming in. He's going to take a lot of the shine off of me. He's going to take a lot of the shine off of the other wrestlers. It's going to be a lot more about Hogan. It's going to be a lot more of a WWF light product instead of being more of a traditional NWA WCW division like we always used to be. So it's mixed emotions, but I suppose the businessman in Ric Flair was probably thinking more money in his back pocket.
Yeah, no, I agree there, right? And we're talking about buy rates and stuff like that. To put this into some perspective of how well this did or didn't do, this done really well. I mean, this drew a monstrous buy rating, and to put it into some against Bash at the Beach like 93, this was like, I think that was 0.50. This was 1.02 buy rate. So this was gigantic for them. They'd really gone up on the pay-per-views. And so this definitely drew what they, I'm sure more than what they even expected at that time. So it definitely did the business for them in that sense. Like there's no two ways about it. Would you have been surprised if it was anything other than that? Because to put it in more perspective, this wasn't. I mean, this is on almost the level with WrestleMania of that year at 10. So, you'd have thought Vince McMahon would have been like, blimey, there's problems now. But like I say, this was a match that I suppose is still kind of fresh to have, even though there's been 2 years. I mean, it seems like there's a long bit of distance. It's still there. I don't think, quite frankly, going into this has the same magic or aura that WrestleMania 8 would have done. But again, WCW, they're trying to make this. I just wish it was at Starrcade. That would have been my only
but you can
thing.
see, they're throwing Mr. T at it. They're throwing Shaquille O'Neal. You've got Nick Bockwinkel in the ring, who was the commissioner of WCW at the time. So they're throwing a lot of star power into this, a lot of outside booking, shall we say. They're trying to make it a big match feel by having Michael Buffer there, and I think Michael Buffer was fairly new to the company before. It was always Gary Michael Capetta. So they really are kind of throwing everything into this, and this was the direction for WCW after that. Everything was bigger, everything was grander, everything had more star appeal, and you could say that, thanks to Hogan, really, the only people that alienated was the people that liked the traditional wrestling that WCW would tend to offer. I suppose outside of the Hogan feuds in WCW, they still had some pretty good action, some pretty good matches, but then they started introducing a lot of Hogan's cronies like Jim Duggan and Brutus Beefcake would come in, and it got a little bit silly throughout the the entire card, top to bottom. You can certainly understand, look, with the buy rate that you announced, was it 1.2 compared to 0.5 the year before? You can certainly understand why they wanted to hit the ground running with this big main event on the first show, and that they probably didn't want to wait 3, 4, 5, 6 months until having that big match. And yes, it would have been probably even more of a spectacle having it on Starrcade, their version of WrestleMania. But if I'm not mistaken, and we'll probably get to it, but they had a longer feud beyond this one match where they met a few times before. And I know that this wasn't the be all and end all blow off match between these two. This was just the start of their feud. And to a lot of people, the reason why the buy rate was so good was this was the first televised match between these two. So no doubt the buy rate was going to be used. You had that intrigue from traditional WWE fans, from traditional Hulk Hogan fans, and maybe bringing in that WWF audience as well that were intrigued to see what could have been.
I'm glad you brought that up as well, because that's one thing that shouldn't be underestimated, that there definitely was intrigue from WWF fans to watch Hulk Hogan in WCW. I definitely feel he was that big enough of a draw to quite a big chunk of the audience, especially fans that were kids back then that had followed Hogan and now were becoming teenagers, and he is seeing him at a different level, but there's nostalgia there, and you want to see him up against in a new, it's going to be totally fresh because he's in a new promotion. He definitely took a handful. I'm not saying that they just stopped watching WWF, but they certainly were tuning into WCW to check out what Hulk Hogan was doing. And even if you didn't like Hulk Hogan, there's still intrigue, there's still interest to watch this match, and I'm pretty sure that's why this ended up doing well. I think, like you say, they probably the way they booked this with having this many matches in the feud, I can imagine they sat there and worked all that out before this, which was typical at WCW to do that back then. That's how they used to do a lot of their matches, like with Ricky Steamboat and Flair and Sting. They would always have that. I don't really think that Hogan and Flair, it presents itself quite in the same way. I do think these have to be more sort of one-off type matches, if you will. Like maybe you have it every year, or you know what I mean. Like, but to have a series, I don't know that it's served the same value as that one box office exclusive, and then have a rematch like way further down the road, if you know what I mean. But let me ask you, when was the last time you saw this match, or at all?
Wow. Let's think. I probably purchased this Bash at the Beach on VHS when it first became available around the same time. I almost certainly saw it. I think it was very, very strange because you couldn't purchase WCW pay-per-views back in the day.
That's right.
I think you would get it on delay through the Cartoon Network or through TNT.
That's right.
And I think if you were clever, there was like a German channel called RTL that would show the WCW pay-per-views before they would air on an English-speaking channel. So I would tend to watch the WCW pay-per-views back in this era through a German channel with German commentary.
Educational as well, you see.
Exactly. You could just about make out the American commentary in the background, but it would be overdubbed. You could hear the German commentary. So that made it a bit of a weird experience on top of everything that was going on in the ring. But so I probably saw it quite a few times around that same time. In all honesty, I've probably not seen it since 1994 or 1995.
Yeah.
So we're talking 25 years apart.
Yeah, the last time I saw this was 98, and I remember it vividly because I watched it with my friend. But that is the last time I've seen this particular match in its entirety. Thus far, I will say they've gone a completely different route to what they did in MSG, and they have they've gone for that slower. But you've noticed Hogan doing some real wrestling stuff in this as well, which is kind of like that.
Here we go.
It's almost like he's trying to prove a point. I can wrestle. He's trying to get in with that new audience. I can do this stuff. And it's worth pointing out as well that Hogan, a lot more leaner here in his appearance, in his physicality than his heyday of where we last saw him in 91. And he'd leaned out pretty much, I think, even at WrestleMania 93. He looked a lot different. And you can certainly tell that here.
Well, it was around latter part of 91 and going into 92 that the whole steroid trial scandal came to surface. So when you saw Hogan after WrestleMania 8 going into WrestleMania 9 at Caesar's Palace 1993, he did look a lot leaner then. Of course, he'd been out of the business for a little while until he kind of reappeared to save his body on that episode of Monday Night Raw. And then we all know what happened at WrestleMania 9. But I think that was all around the time of the steroid trial and steroid scandal. So they obviously had to change their habits a little bit. But is it wrong of me to say that I liked Hogan better when he was more beefy and more bulked up?
No, I don't think so. I get what you mean.
His appearance, in the 80s and early 90s was much better. But he lost a little bit of something for me back in these days because he, like when Warrior returns or reappeared at WrestleMania 8, he looked different, the same as Hogan looks different here. So the kind of the cosmetics looked a bit different and maybe changed my fascination with the character, if that's makes any sense.
Yeah, no, perfectly. And I mean, it's worth pointing out that he did, obviously we know the route he went with the NWO and what a massive influence he had, again, reinventing himself. And I think I bought into that more than this, I would say. I thought he was cool again, quite frankly, when he was doing that NWO stuff. He had the black in his beard, the dark and stuff. And again, it was a great way for him to reinvent himself and to be believable. So it goes to show you Hogan definitely had more. But I think as playing this sort of baby face, you can only do it for so long without it getting a little bit stale. But you definitely wouldn't have used Hogan. There was no point bringing Hogan in now as the heel.